In life, war. In death, peace. In life, shame. In death, atonement. The Death Korps of Krieg is the name given to all of the Astra Militarum regiments that originate from the devastated post-atomic Death World of Krieg in the Segmentum Tempestus. They are most commonly deployed in the war zones of the Segmentum Tempestus and Segmentum Solar, and are particularly skilled at attritional trench warfare, sieges of and assaults upon heavily fortified static positions, and warfare in extreme environments, known for their biological, chemical, and radioactive hazards. Krieg was the site of a rebellion against the Imperium of Man over 1,500 standard years ago in the 40th millennium, and was bombarded with nuclear weapons, followed by 500 Terran years of grinding warfare between loyalists and traitors to purge the heretical rebels. After all those years of nuclear destruction and bitter trench warfare, Krieg was reduced to a scorched, radioactive husk of a world composed of dust and mud, whose surviving people were forced to retreat into underground hive cities to survive the toxic planetary environment. The Death Korps of Krieg is a siege specialist militarum regimento of the Astra Militarum, and the regiments raised on Krieg seek to repent for their people's former treachery against the Emperor by displaying a disturbing disregard for their own lives in combat. Death Korps troops excel at wars of attrition and defensive combat in particular. Grim, fatalistic, and dour, selflessly wading into some of the most grueling and abhorrent war zones saturated with radiation or other toxins, or solar decades-long sieges with sky-high casualty rates, the men and women of Krieg are a breed apart. Almost all Imperial Guardsmen from Krieg, save vehicle crews, wear distinctive and highly advanced respirator units that filter out toxic and radioactive particulates. These are a relic of their world's poisoned legacy and a reminder of Krieg's eternal service to the needs of the Imperium. In 433.M30, the once loyal Imperial world of Krieg declared independence and renounced the glory of the God Emperor. At that moment, the world was changed forever. Colonel Jurten, commander of the 83rd Krieg Regiment of the Astra Militarum, gathered to him all those still loyal to the Imperium and struck back against the rebellion, choosing to unleash the horror of atomic bombardment upon those who had forsaken the Emperor. After 500 standard years of atomic fire, continent-spanning trench warfare, and thunderous artillery barrages, the attempted secession of Krieg was halted, but at great cost. Krieg had become a blasted, irradiated wasteland, barely inhabitable by humans. The remaining population was forced to exist in the subterranean bunkers and tunnels that had spread across the planet during the war, and found that they could not walk upon the surface without protective equipment. Seeking to atone for the betrayal their world's government had committed, and with no other resources left to offer up in the Imperial tithe, the people of Krieg set about providing the only thing they had left: manpower. Hardened by generations of war in an atomic wasteland, the Krieg people were already well prepared to be sent out into the galaxy as Imperial Guardsmen. Trained amongst the irradiated ruins of long-dead cities, equipped for the most hostile environments, and raised on sermons of self-sacrifice and penitence, the Krieg regiments have commonly been deployed, often at their own request, to some of the deadliest war zones, from the toxic ash wastes that surround many hive cities, to the brutal wars of attrition and years-long sieges. The Krieg have gained a reputation for their grim attitude and uncompromising nature. Disdainful of retreat or surrender, and fighting without fear of death, the soldiers of Krieg seem to have no regard for their own lives. Indeed, the prevailing attitude amongst the Krieg is that they are little more than living weapons for the Emperor's will, faceless and infinitely replaceable behind their anonymous rebreather masks, and they hold self-sacrifice as the highest of ideals. In the wake of Krieg's history, its troops are consumed with a fervent cultural need to find atonement, and their cult of sacrifice has been shaped by an even greater disregard for the lives of individual soldiers than that espoused by most other militarum regimentos. Bred in underground facilities geared only for war, the regiments of Krieg take harsh training to extremes, and their unfeeling attitude makes them ideal for siege and trench warfare. In battle, the sheer resilience and indefatigability of the Death Korps' inexhaustible soldiery grinds down their enemies, while the commanders merely send in the next wave, already firing. Few other regiments feel entirely comfortable alongside the Krieg, with moral issues often arising as a result. Commissars assigned to Krieg regiments are not required to maintain order and zeal, as is normally the case, but rather to ease interaction between Krieg and non-Krieg regiments and actually work to curb the self-sacrificial tendencies of their charges. Given the depleted population of Krieg, it is a wonder that so many guardsmen can be produced, even with the entire world's remaining efforts devoted to that sole end. Vicious rumours continue to circle around the world's regiments of unnatural methods used to bolster birth and recruitment rates, producing children artificially to ensure that there are always soldiers to give their lives for the Emperor's wars. To date, no investigations by the Adeptus Mechanicus have presented any evidence of this, but speculation continues nonetheless. It is also believed that the average age of a Krieg infantryman is believed to be considerably lower than on other worlds. Some officials even insinuate that the bulk of these troops hide their juvenile traits behind the rebreather masks and that their soldiers haven't reached physical maturity. Before the fall. Much of the early history of what was once the hive world of Krieg in the Segmentum Tempestus is shrouded in rumour, allegory, and dark myth. Its dreadful history of rebellion and treachery has been obscured and lost by the mists of time. This once thriving hive world was a trading and manufacturing centre that was populated by billions. Yet Krieg is now covered in a wilderness of ruined cities that span the poison-choked world. Bloated with wealth and corrupt with indolence, the former rulers of this world, the Council of Autocrats, was rife with petty vendetta and vice. This ruling oligarchy became increasingly insular and debauched over time. Their paranoia over an outside threat that could shatter their dictatorial rule caused them to sink vast resources into strengthening the defences of their hive cities, building private armies and further surrounding their world with an outward-facing ring of steel. Worse, the autocrats grew to resent the influence of the imperial administratum on their world, and in particular the heavy tithes levied on them by the Departamento Militarum, taking resources they protested were vital to their own defense. The citizens of Krieg were sadly ignorant of these slowly spiraling events and the terrible ruin the misrule of their leaders was about to bring down upon them. Revolt. In 433.M30, the end came for Krieg in the form of the man who served as the High Autocrat of Krieg's largest hive city, the chairman of the world's Council of Autocrats and the de facto planetary governor. A man so hated that his name has been purged from all imperial records by an edict of obliteration. The High Autocrat declared planetary-wide martial law, and that Krieg was now independent of the Imperium of Man. He further renounced the Emperor of Mankind as his divine master and political overlord. Krieg was then immediately devoured by a civil war which erupted suddenly and violently between the heretical traitors who supported the High Autocrat and those citizens of Krieg who remained firm Imperial loyalists. After the rebels' initial attacks, much of Krieg quickly fell to the heretics, save for Hive Ferrograd, which remained under loyalist control under the command of the now infamous Colonel Jurten of the 83rd Krieg Regiment of the Astra Militarum. In response to the revolt, Colonel Jurten moved quickly to take control of the Hive city from its vacillating rulers in a military coup. With the veteran colonel at its helm, Ferrograd rapidly became the rallying point for the remaining loyalist factions. But the situation for the loyalists was dire. The rebel forces numbered in the millions, and Ferrograd was soon cut off and besieged. The loyalists were on their own. The planetary defences were under the traitors' control, and those defences were strong enough that a full-scale fleet action would be required to breach them. Colonel Jurten had been informed in no uncertain terms by the Segmentum Command that an Imperial fleet on the scale necessary to invade Krieg would not be forthcoming. His orders were to resist with all means at his disposal, to engage the enemy, to punish their treachery, and emerge victorious, whatever the cost. So, faced with the horrific odds stacked against him, Colonel Jurten came to the fateful decision that Krieg would either belong to the Emperor or to no one at all. Within a secret Adeptus Mechanicus storage facility located deep below Hive Ferrograd, Colonel Jurten, with his loyal Mechanicus ally Archmagos Greel, moved to unlock the facility and to unleash the forbidden and ancient weapons within. While outside the siege ground on, within Ferrograd's walls the defenders laboured on a desperate plan. The Purging. On the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, Jurten unleashed his long-planned counterattack using atomic weapons to enact a great cleansing of the planet's heretical population. The traitors watched their augurs helplessly as Jurten's ballistic missiles arced high into the planet's stratosphere before detonating in blooms of blinding light and unleashing tons of lethal isotopes which blanketed the entire world in a deadly radioactive fallout. For days, Krieg was engulfed in a sea of nuclear fire. Krieg's already tainted and marginal ecosystem collapsed, and as a result, untold billions died due to the raging fires blocking out the sun and the nuclear winter that followed. To future generations who would live with the terrible consequences of the atomic attack, Jurten's plan would come to be known as the Purging. Krieg might have been transformed into a blasted wasteland, but the Purging had evened up the odds. The Loyalists had been well prepared for the attack, while the traitors suffered terribly. But the civil war dragged on, regardless. The survivors from Jurten's nuclear purge were forced to exist in underground bunkers, or deep in the radioactive chem wastes of the Hive world, as their descendants do to this day. To the Imperial authorities, Krieg was a prize no longer worth saving, its fate a red mark in the ledgers of the Administratum. Krieg became a man-made death world, trapped in the freezing grip of a radioactive nuclear winter. The bloody war of attrition continued to rage between the surviving secessionists and loyalist troops across a planet where every inch of ground was eventually littered with trenches, rusting razor wire, and shell craters, in a deadly landscape where drifting radioactive fallout ash shrouded the numberless bones of the unburied dead. A full accounting of those terrible centuries of civil war will never be known. Colonel Jurten finally perished, how, it is not recorded, but the descendants of those that followed him lived on, and became as fearless as they were callous. War would become all that they would ever know, raised to fight from the cradle to the grave. The warriors that advanced great-coated and vapor-masked through the rad wastes and blasted cities of Krieg would become known as the Death Korps, existing only to endure the hellish planetary surface in order to do their duty and to kill in the Emperor's name. The Loyalists slowly retook their blasted world in the name of the Emperor over 15 generations of terrible bloody attrition, trench by trench and tunnel by tunnel, with bayonet, brutality, and when needed, atomic fire. After more than 500 standard years of the most nightmarish warfare imaginable and an incalculable price paid in human life and suffering, Krieg belonged to the Death Korps. From this long civil conflict and the unique military and planetary culture it endangered was born the tradition of naming Astra Militarum regiments drawn from Krieg as the Death Korps. Krieg was finally returned fully to the Imperium fold in 949.M40. Engine of War. The Krieg method of war is a measure of discipline and their sacrifice. It demands respect from all, friend and foe alike. Though Krieg was returned to imperial rule with little fanfare or regard, the Departamento Militarum took note. Krieg was in arrears, so a new tithe of troops for the Astra Militarum was placed upon it. The Militarum adepts were surprised when the Krieg authorities offered them not 1, but 20 regiments for immediate deployment, all formed, trained and equipped, and each commander requested the most hazardous imperial war zones available. During 5 standard centuries of warfare, the people of Krieg had not sat idle, as beneath the blasted exterior of their world, entire subterranean cities had been founded, tens of thousands of kilometers of bunkers and passageways dug, and a vast underworld of industry and manufacture geared specifically to the production of arms and equipment, but most of all to the production of soldiers. Soldiers who proved to be as implacable as the factory lines that armed them, and as pitiless as their blasted radioactive world. Acting quickly, the Departamento Militarum's need for soldiers was immediate. These new Death Korps regiments were inducted into the Astra Militarum, reorganized and issued with commissars before being sent straight into combat. The deployment of the regiments from the Death Korps of Krieg was immediately successful, despite the misgivings of some of the regiments they served alongside. In war zones that mirrored the horrific state of their homeworld, the Death Korps regiments proved superior in performance to other Imperial Guard Militarum regimentos. On worlds that were radioactive wastes, chemical or biological toxic zones, and polluted ash worlds, Astra Militarum generals quickly capitalized on deploying the Death Korps. Stalemates were broken and advances achieved that otherwise would have required the massive expenditure of penal legion troops or the use of valuable elite forces such as the Adeptus Astartes. When Krieg's independence was eliminated and the world was taken directly under the authority of the Departamento Militarum, the maximum tithe levels were enforced. Krieg's sole purpose was to turn out Death Korps soldiers as another world might mine ore or sow wheat. By the direct order of the High Lords of Terror, nothing was to be allowed to interfere with this purpose. This has resulted in suspect practices being tolerated. Some, such as the eugenic policies designed to weed out mutations caused by Krieg's damaged radioactive biosphere, and universal conscription, are continuations of policies once required during Krieg's centuries of civil war. It should be noted that Krieg raises an unusually large number of Astra Militarum regiments for such a devastated planet. This is attributed to the enforced use of the vitae womb birthing technique, which Krieg has been granted special dispensation to use as the result of their famous steel, determination, and unswerving loyalty to the Emperor. Use of this technique is largely unknown outside of the Officio Medicae, and is seen as dangerous and as abhorrent as Adeptus Mechanicus Magibiologus. As it stands today, Krieg is a true war world. It has no industry or agriculture to offer to the Emperor, only its people, giving up its descendants to fight in the Astra Militarum. Krieg's tithes are the maximum for the planet's population, raising tens of regiments every standard year, where a comparably sized world might be expected to tithe 1 regiment every solar decade. The rate of attrition and destruction among these regiments is likewise disproportionately high, as they are assigned to some of the most hazardous battlefields and dangerous worlds known to mankind. Proving themselves extremely effective troops, the Death Korps have proved capable of achieving victories against the odds by dint of bloody sacrifice, endurance, aggression, and unbreakable loyalty. But despite their glorious service record, Krieg units are not well liked by Astra Militarum commanders who find these troops to be morose, taciturn, all too willing to accept high casualties, even against their commanders, and difficult to deal with by non-Krieg natives. But in the strife and unending state of war that exists in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Imperium of Man has dire need of such troops. The use and number of Death Korps regiments is on the rise, as are the resources being devoted to their creation by the Departamento Militarum.